Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the show. It has been quite some time since you have seen me, but you're probably wondering why this show is coming on later in the day. Well, it is because I am coming to you live. For the very first time in the history of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, you are seeing me live wherever you are in the world, whatever device you are using, whether it be on YouTube, Twitch, or any other the platforms we stream through. You are seeing me live and in the flesh. But if I do mess up, please be patient with me. This is my first time. I'm trying to get my bearings, and I really hope that all of you are looking forward to today's show because it's going to be a special one. We have a betting preview. We are only 2 weeks away from the football season. So I thought, what better way to get tuned in to the NFL season than by looking at all the divisions and doing some betting previews on them. We are also going to be looking at the QB position. Thank you already, shots below the belt. I appreciate it. Thank you. As we get some comments, there's another thing that I will talk to you about later. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you guys yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. And as my man, Shots Below the Belt, is saying, I think that you guys will enjoy this next part. You now have a bigger say in what I get to talk on this show, and that is what I truly love. Interaction with you all. I truly like all your opinions. It's something that has been lacking ever since I started in terms of, pre-recording and things of that nature. But today is a special day. Now I present to you many different ways in which you can interact with the show, whether it be through our super chat, our super thanks, or through super stickers. Make yourselves available to those because I want this show to be as friendly to you guys as possible. You, the audience, have been waiting for a very long time for the season, especially if you're a fantasy football fan. So this will be very helpful to you and to me and ultimately the network as a whole. Without further ado, let's jump right into the first ever live show in the history of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Those words sure do sound nice. And let's start off in the NFC. The NFC, the conference, definitely looking to be the better conference this year. The AFC over past years has gained confidence in terms of getting all their teams to the Super Bowl. We have the Chiefs looking to three-peat, but the NFC wants to rise up and say, hey, we have a very deep conference as well. And we start off with one of the deepest divisions in the NFC East. Definitely one of the most volatile ones. You may not think it's deep. Let me know what you think in the comments. I definitely think that this division is very deep. Can produce maybe even 3 teams in the playoffs this year. That's my bold prediction, at least in my humble opinion. But let's start off with the NFC East without further ado. In terms of betting previews, it's going to be a very interesting division to kind of sink your teeth into if you're a huge gambler. I really like this division in terms of where it's headed. Whether you're a Cowboys fan and you have trepidations about how the team is looking, even though CeeDee Lamb just signed that record contract deal. He also had to be worried about the whole Dak Prescott situation, but there's still a lot of excitement around that team. Or if you're an Eagles fan, you definitely want to see this team back in the playoffs, but back as a Super Bowl contender with Jalen Hurts wanting to improve each and every year. Nick Sirianni, let's hope that he can get back on track because he's a stellar coach, in my humble opinion. But also, if you're a Washington Commanders fan, I really like the Washington Commanders this year. They have a very interesting new look offense with Jaden Daniels, Heisman winner at LSU his last year at the college level. You bring in Austin Eckler, an exciting running back. You have Brian Robinson, great depth there, if I do say so myself. Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson. And then if you're a Giants fan, the less I say, the better. I'm sorry. The Giants, it is not your year. Maybe Daniel Jones shocks the world and Brian Dable can get him back. But that's enough of my rambling on about all these teams. Let's get into the betting preview, the meat of the show, the prime topic that we are going to be talking about. Let's start off with the division favorites. No surprise here. It is the Eagles. A lot of people might have thought the Cowboys would be the ones as the division favorites, but the Eagles sit as the division favorites at plus 130. And if I do say so myself, that's a nice bet. I think that it's a comfortable bet. I think that Jalen Hurts will get back to being that positive influence on this offense. I do believe that their defense is steadily improving. All that Georgia talent up front, whether it be Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis in the trenches, Nolan Smith at the linebacker position. And then their really interesting secondary. I really like their secondary. If you can incorporate Quinion Mitchell, get Cooper DeJean, kind of a hybrid linebacker safety player incorporated, maybe make it more youthful, get rid of Darius Slay, even though he's going to be very helpful in this transition, I think the Eagles are the safest bet to win the division. That being said, I also like the bets associated with the players. Hurts, 5th in MVP odds at 13-1. He may not be the most appealing quarterback to pick for MVP odds, but he certainly profiles as someone who is going to be a guy that is going to be in the discussion. I think you might say Mahomes, Allen, maybe Prescott, maybe even Brock Purdy, because he has all those weapons, will be in the conversation for MVP. But don't forget about Jalen Hurts just because he had kind of a down year last year. Then also, in terms of Super Bowl odds, the Eagles have the 5th shortest Super Bowl odds at 11-1. And while it certainly feels like it's too soon to say, hey, the Eagles should be the contenders in the NFC East, they could contend for the Super Bowl, those are interesting odds as well. You don't get many teams who have had such a down season to be kind of at this level. And so I really think that they're a value pick. But at the end of the day, that's all I have on the Eagles. They are a very intriguing team. Now let's get to some of the best bets. I think that as this kind of segment goes along, I'm going to divide them up evenly between some of the best bets, some of the bets that you might not want to push as much, and then the long shot bets, those that I think are pretty interesting but might not really hit for you. The best bet I'll start off with, Hurts 30-plus TD passes at plus 650. Kind of a risky bet, but I do think that Hurts has the offense, has the weapons he needs to get back to being that prolific passer. I like A.J. Brown. I like Devontae Smith. And overall, this offense is just too good. It has too many weapons to not have Jalen Hurts be someone who you believe can throw that many touchdown passes. It's a lofty target. It's a lofty standard for him, but I think that he can hit it. And then, in terms of don't push it, let's talk with the Cowboys. Let's talk about this whole situation where you had these contract holdouts, one being resolved, one maybe not being resolved until later, but also kind of getting into the mindset of, being a team that's going to really rely on the guy I'm going to talk about, and that is CeeDee Lamb. At 1,750 plus receiving yards, and I believe that is at plus 175. It's an interesting bet to think about because CeeDee Lamb, certainly, as this is a fantasy football show, he's going to be someone who you really like in fantasy football. However, in real life, maybe that whole holdout situation really isn't, going to benefit him positively. That's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. And so, I wouldn't push this bet. I like CeeDee Lamb as a receiver. I like him as someone who is going to be relied upon a lot in this offense, and I really believe that this offense is going to be one of the most dynamic in all of football. But at the end of the day, I don't really like this bet in my humble opinion. Then let's go to the long shot. Let's talk with the Giants. We kind of have to. I'm a tri-state area kid. We kind of have to talk about the Giants. Let's talk about a man who has a lot of expectation on his shoulders, Malik Neighbors, their first-round draft pick this year. And at 1,250 plus yards, I'm not taking that bet. It is a long shot at plus 360 as well. That's a little bit low for a guy who steps into one of the worst offenses in the league. But still, if Daniel Jones is just competent enough to get him the ball, then I believe at the end of the day, I like it. I like what the Shots Below the Belt is saying there. Daniel Jones, comeback player of the year. I like it a lot. It's a wild prediction, but I do believe that Daniel Jones may have some merit yet. And he really hasn't had that much opportunity to shine in Brian Dable's system. Yes, he had all those injuries, like Shot Below the Belt is alluding to. And so he is someone who I'm going to be looking at as, can he be the guy for the Giants? Can he get Malik Neighbors? Now he finally has a true number one wide receiver going. Can he get the job done? And ultimately, this bet will depend on their rapport. But at the end of the day, the Giants are definitely a team that you might not pay that much attention to. But if Malik Neighbors gets going, I think that they could have something special there. And then, in terms of overall bets, let's talk with the Eagles yet again. They are the team of the moment in this division. And I think that ultimately where they are in terms of win total is really appealing. I'm going to take the over on them in terms of 10.5 wins. You should take the over as well. At plus 140, they are a team that is primed and ready to go. And I think last year was an aberration. I think that this is a team ready to take the next step forward, ready to wipe away all that happened last year. They are primed to go. And in this NFC, you definitely have your contenders. You have your Lions. I think the Lions really are going to be a trendy pick to make it to the Super Bowl out of the NFC. You have the Cowboys in your own division. You have the 49ers, perhaps the best team in the NFC. We'll talk about them in a little bit later on in the show. But at the end of the day, the Philadelphia Eagles are a team that I feel you can't let fall to the wayside. This is a team that I think will always be competitive in terms of how you bet on them. And ultimately, in the NFC East, they may be the safest bet of all these teams. But overall, I really hope you guys like this segment about the NFC East. I got the comments going. We are our first live stream. I can't believe it. But coming next, we go up north to the NFC North in that division. And there's contenders to be talking about. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. You better believe it. For the first time, we are live. I want to remind you yet again. And with that reminder, I want to remind you of the many ways that you, as my faithful audience, can contribute to the show. I want this show to be more about you guys. That is something we did not have in my quote-unquote pre-recorded era. I want this to be more interactive. I don't want to just be rambling on about my opinions. I want your opinions. And so, without further ado, let's make ourselves available to the super chat, super thanks, and super stickers as well. Any way you want to help contribute to the show, help support the network as a whole, help support my fellow podcasters, shout out to them as well. Go check them out. They are doing great things. But the overall sentiment here is that we want this show to be more about you and less about, just me rambling on, like I said. So, thank you guys in advance for anything you decide to leave. We already got some good comments from my man, Shots Below the Belt. Thank you for all those. But without further ado, let's jump right into our next segment of today's show. Let's switch over from the East to the NFC North, another division with another contender that hasn't been in this situation before, uncharted territory in the NFC North. And I think that this division, while it certainly had some of its off-season storylines, the J.J. McCarthy injury with the Minnesota Vikings, Caleb Williams coming into the Chicago Bears, the team to beat lays in Detroit. And Detroit is such a well-rounded team. What I love about them is they stay true to who they are. They've truly bought into Dan Campbell's culture, and they are ready to take off and become one of the Super Bowl contenders from the NFC. It is their time, and I think that ultimately they deserve to be the division favorites. At plus 135, I think they're the safest bet. They have the third shortest odds for the Super Bowl at 10-1. And I think a lot of people are hopping onto the Lions bandwagon. And you should. I love this offense. This defense is becoming more versatile. There were a lot of questions about this defense. It added a lot of depth. I really think that this team is ready to take the next step, whether it be the Jared Goff. He hasn't been getting the credit that he deserves. I think he's one of the most underrated quarterbacks in the entire NFL. And as a Detroit Lion, he's spreading his wings, really becoming a guy who you can rely upon as a consistent starter. Then Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think that he's also underrated as well, even though he stood out last year, 1,515 yards for him last year, his first time being named to the All-Pro team. I really like him as well. Drafted him to my fantasy team. Yeah, let's not talk about my fantasy team. Well, I got a question from Shots Below the Belt talking about the J.J. McCarthy news, actually. This is a very interesting one. It says, the whole J.J. McCarthy news really affected sports bettors, but I think the Vikings have the potential to be better than what people expect. My thoughts on that. I will get to the Vikings in a second because I do think they're an interesting team. I do think they have talent. They obviously have one of the best wide receivers in all of football, but I'm going to stick with the Lions for now and talk about my best bet. Amon-Ra St. Brown. 1,750 plus receiving yards at plus 550 is a guy who I believe you have to bet on this year. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he is going to be someone to look out for. I think that this year, after such a prolific season last year, becoming that number one target for Jared Goff, I really think that even though this Lions offense is going to become more diverse, and Sam Laporta is still there, Jahmyr Gibbs is there, I think that everything revolves around how Amon-Ra St. Brown plays. Because if he's moving the football, the Lions are moving the football. If Jared Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown have that connection, the Lions will be a very solid team. So that's my best bet. Let's talk about the Minnesota Vikings a little bit, though. I want to touch on my man Shots Below the Belt's question here before we get into other teams in this division. I think that the whole profile about betting on the Vikings is an interesting one because of the quarterback situation. Sam Darnold, hasn't always been that high-profile guy, but I will give it to him. I do believe that he is a consistent backup. Now that he's the starter, though, I think that you have to shy away from the Minnesota Vikings, and it will be translated in these bets that I'll be talking about. Because notice how none of these upcoming bets that I'll be talking about include the Minnesota Vikings. They are a team that had a lot of potential, maybe the whole question about how long will Sam Darnold start, the whole J.J. McCarthy hype, when will he come into this team, and if he does, will he make it any better, really raises the levels of how people bet on them prior to the J.J. McCarthy injury. But I think that it's just a team that I think you might have to fade away. I'm not saying that they can't be better than expected, but my kind of wheelhouse for them right now is 5 wins. I don't see them getting over that benchmark. If their entire system kind of comes around Sam Darnold and no frustration sets in if he's not connecting with J.J. Jefferson or other players on this offense, then maybe they could be a sneaky team. But at this current moment, I think that this division is just growing, getting more youthful, and right now, I don't think the Vikings have that experience and depth necessary to compete with that. But let's get more into the other bets in this division. In terms of a bet that I don't want you guys to push, let's talk about Jordan Love a little bit. He's currently sitting at 4,500 passing yards projected at 6-1. Those are very lofty odds for me. And for a guy just going into his second year, yes, I like the youthfulness. One of the youngest teams, if not the youngest team, I believe, in the NFL last season. Still hold that status. I think that youth is a good thing. But usually, a quarterback like Jordan Love, who had a rough start to the beginning last season, his first season as a full-time starter for the Green Bay Packers, to the end of the season, now coming into his second year. I believe he is someone who is going to be a guy that always wants to compete. But at the end of the day, youth is the difference between a Detroit Lions team who has experience and a Packers team who kind of were ahead of schedule. And so that's how I view this, Ben, and that's why I don't push it. We have another comment from Shots Below the Belt arguing his case. He's saying that they have Jefferson, Addison. They did add Aaron Jones. My mistake there in not mentioning him. He's saying that Darnold does not have to be elite, kind of like a Brock Purdy situation. I agree with that sentiment. But the Minnesota Vikings, I like them a lot, but I just think that at this current moment, it's about the division. And while I certainly think that, there are more question marks about, say, the Chicago Bears, a team who a lot of people are heaping expectations on, and, let's say the Packers, like I said, may not live up to the lofty expectations, and so this argument can ring true. I think that at this current moment in time, perhaps the Minnesota Vikings might not want to be good, and here's why. If the Minnesota Vikings, say, are a 7-10 and 8-9 team, and they're picking early in the draft, I think that, as my father comments, low expectations, fine with Viking faithful, I agree with that sentiment. And I believe that this Vikings team will be fine with that. And going forward, the Minnesota Vikings feel like they have the infrastructure for when J.J. McCarthy is fully healthy to get to that level again. So if they win more than 6 to 9 games, you're looking at a very high draft position. And while you could use that to your advantage in terms of building up your draft capital, I don't necessarily think that's what the Vikings want to do. I believe that this team, outside of the QB position, is primed and ready to go. And so that is why I'm low on the Vikings this year, but I'm high on their future right now. But thank you to both of those comments. They're fantastic points. I agree that Darnold could have a Brock Purdy-like season, but I also believe that Vikings fans might want to look ahead to future years. Let's talk about another team in this division who has interesting expectations, the Chicago Bears. And this brings me to my long shot bet, Caleb Williams. Let's talk about him. So much hype around this young man. First overall pick in this year's draft, but a lot of expectation, and certainly an expectation that can be justified seeing as to how he has a lot of talent in that wide receiver room. At 4,000 plus passing yards, though, I don't necessarily think that that's a goal that he can hit. And he's going to have to figure out a way to really parse out who he wants as a true number one receiver. You have a guy in DJ Moore who has had experience with the Bears. You have a guy in Roma Dunza, one of the most promising young rookies in the league. That's a fantastic addition. Maybe that rookie connection really works for them. But then you have a guy in Keenan Allen who's been around the league so much, played so many valuable games with the Los Angeles Chargers, and really brings that level of experience that a young rookie quarterback like Caleb Williams might want. And so it's going to be interesting to see how Caleb Williams figures out, okay, I have an interesting dynamic in my receiver room, so how do I make it that none of these guys get frustrated? And that's my worry with him. 4,000 pass yards is a lofty expectation for any quarterback. In fact, I only think about 3 or 4 guys in the league right now are capable of hitting that. And for a rookie, I think that you have to shy away from this bet. But the last point I want to make as we finish with a safer bet, Jordan Love, 6 shortest odds to win MVP. Make of that what you will. But the point I want to make about the NFC North, right? All of these teams are teams that have an interesting storyline to them. They're teams that fit the profile of ready to contend. There are teams that are getting more youthful. There are teams like the Vikings who believe they have the infrastructure but may wait to go all in with J.J. McCarthy once he's back healthy. And you have a team like the Packers who I believe should have more questions surrounding them than people expect of them. And so this division certainly is going to be an interesting one. I just want to address this last question here before we go to the break from Shots Below the Belt. Talented quarterback was there with Justin Fields. The O-line, fantastic point. Are the Bears asking too much of Caleb? They did actually add a lot of depth to that O-line, but I also agree with that sentiment. I think that Caleb Williams is one of those quarterbacks who runs to throw the football, if that makes sense. He doesn't want to run as often as he does, but his ability to create plays out of structure cannot be ignored. I just think that this year is too lofty a standard for that 4,000 passing yards benchmark. But it all will come down to how his receivers react to him as well. It's not just the O-line. I think that the O-line is a big question mark that the Bears had coming into this season, but I think that they addressed it perfectly with some additions, and it's going to come down to how he reacts to the receivers. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we transition to the ugliest division in all of football, the NFC South. Who will emerge from there, and what will go on in terms of betting odds in that division? We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, our very first live show. I hope you all are enjoying it. We now go from north to south in terms of NFC divisions as we continue our divisional betting previews 2 weeks before the start of the NFL season. We have to talk about this division in the NFC South. I know it's not everyone's favorite division to talk about because of how ugly it gets, but it is a very fascinating division because of its parity, because it is so even. Nobody truly knows how to win, but it also adds question marks surrounding, well, how do you bet on this division? But I think this year became a little bit easier. We saw the Atlanta Falcons swing for the fences, pick up Kirk Cousins. There will be questions about how he looks after he sustained an ACL injury last year. Pain for Minnesota Vikings fans. I know my father is in the chat. But outside of that, I think it's a good pickup. They have a very interesting offense. Let's talk with the Tampa Bay Bucks a little bit. Baker Mayfield. What about him? Fantastic season, but gone is Dave Canales, kind of the QB whisperer from that offensive scheme. How will Baker adjust to new offensive coordinators calling the shots? I think that he's a solid quarterback, but I think this year may take a back seat. He still has Mike Evans, a paragon of consistency at the wide receiver position, but I think that, well, with the Atlanta Falcons adding Kirk Cousins to this offense, giving them a dynamic quarterback after so many years of inconsistent QB play, it adds a certain dynamic that makes them the division favorites. Minus 135. I think they deserve that mark. It could all come tumbling down. Hear me out on that. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is when you add that dynamic quarterback to an offense that was begging for it, I think that just rejuvenates the team. I think that Bijan's going to be used more. I think that Kyle Pitts' talent's going to be realized. And I believe that Drake London, who already has been a prolific receiver, even with inconsistent QB play, will have his moment to shine. Then, let's look at Tampa again, because Tampa is the wild card in this division. They're either going to be a team, like I said, who will forget the loss of Dave Canales. Baker's going to stay consistent, or they're going to be a team that suffers from the loss of Dave Canales, especially Baker Mayfield. And Baker Mayfield will kind of regress back to what we saw in his early stages as a Cleveland Brown. I still have high hopes for him, but it's all going to come down to that. They still have Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, dynamic offense. They have a decent defense. I like its profile. You have Big Vita Vea up front. You have Antoine Winfield Jr. kind of shutting opposing offenses down as a safety. But at the end of the day, I just think that there's too much volatility in this division for me to go all in Tampa. And a plus, I don't have the odds here to make the playoffs. Plus 145 actually is the odds currently for them. I think those are odds that you might want to shy away from. They look very good on paper, but at the end of the day, I'm a little bit concerned about how Baker Mayfield is going to react to losing such an important part of who he was as a quarterback last year. And then let's talk about the New Orleans Saints. They are definitely a team that can be reckoned with. I, for many years, have been defending Derek Carr, but this year, I don't necessarily like him. I was like, oh, Derek Carr's deep ball is one of the best in the league. I really like his deep ball, but alas, he's getting older. I don't like this offense outside of Chris Olave, outside of maybe Alvin Kamara, who's also getting up there in age as well. But I just don't like it. And plus 210 to miss the postseason, that's an easy bet for me. I'm willing to say that the Saints will miss the postseason. Be a team that might be there, might see it out to the end of the season, might make this division a 3-horse race potentially, but they don't have enough in the tank. They don't have enough talent to really wow me or sway me into saying that, hey, this is a playoff team. In terms of how I looked at this division in terms of best bets, don't push it in long shots, let's talk about how all of these skill position players can profile. In terms of best bets, Mike Evans. How about him? 10 straight seasons, 1,000 plus yards. First ballot Hall of Famer in my opinion. Paragon of consistency. And at 1,500 plus receiving yards, that's the total over-under here for him. At 5-1 odds, I'm taking them, man. A lot of people forget about Mike Evans. And I think that's kind of alluding to perhaps a mindset of, well, he's had so many quarterbacks throughout his career, and he's a guy who you don't necessarily think a lot about because he's not a quote-unquote superstar in terms of like his playmaking ability, but that's what consistent wide receivers do. They don't necessarily make a lot of noise like Justin Jefferson in terms of like their brand, but they're just consistent. They just get the job done. That's what Mike Evans does. In terms of not pushing it, I talked about Kamara before. I talked about how he's getting up there in age. The Saints offense is really starting to become less and less dynamic. And at 1,000 rush yards, at plus 475, I'm going to have to say you don't want to push that bet. I really, really think that the Saints team, as much as I want to like them, just doesn't have it. Derek Carr is not the quarterback that he needs to be. And most importantly, he's not a quarterback who can get the most out of the final years of Alvin Kamara's career, but also a young receiver in Chris Olave. And as much as people might argue that Alvin Kamara offers a lot in terms of his dual threat ability, he's a runner and a receiver, I don't think that the Saints offense should be predicated on that. Because as much as I'm not defending Derek Carr's deep ball anymore, that's probably the best aspect of his game. And you don't want to anger Chris Olave because he's going to be there for quite some time. And so you want to focus on him really being a sustainable piece of that offense. So that's one of the many reasons why I don't think that Alvin Kamara bet will hit. And then let's talk with a long shot. A team that we haven't mentioned just yet, mainly because they profile as one of the worst in the NFL, but maybe not this year. The Carolina Panthers. And last year, obviously, you gotta say they can't get worse than that. 2-15 last year. Bryce Young really struggling. But this year could be different. They add Deontay Johnson. They add Xavier Legette, one of the most underrated receivers from this draft class. Hear me out. I like him. Fantastic body control. Fantastic in terms of contested catches. I think he's really a profile of a guy who might be one of Bryce Young's favorites. At the end of the day, 3,750 yards is a very lofty goal for Bryce Young. And as I see shots below the belt saying, take the over on win, strong bet, big payout. I think that the Panthers are going to be one of those teams that, can't get worse. And he's right in that sentiment. But I do think that they still, with adding all these pieces to the offense, will have to figure out how they profile, because Bryce Young definitely had so many struggles. You can put it down to the O-line. You can put it down to coaching. You got to fix those first. He has the weapons, and I think it's going to be all about connection. I'm not necessarily confident enough in terms of taking the over on wins, but I do like how this team is profiling in terms of bettering itself. And Anthony Manzano here saying it's a scheme that Carolina is trying to run. Do they feel they are more successful with smaller, shifty receivers like a Tyreek, or biggie body receivers that are known for jump balls? That's an interesting question, because when I look at this offense, the only kind of big body receiver that I see is Adam Thielen, and he's also getting up there in age. And he's one of those guys who is not necessarily someone who I see as a person who is going to be able to produce for Bryce Young much further in his career. And when I think about the direction they took, Xavier Legette, he is kind of a smaller body, but he is one of those guys who plays like he has a much bigger body profile. And then you look at a Deontay Johnson. He's definitely a speedster. We saw him in the Steelers offense. Really couldn't necessarily get going as much as people expected him to do. But this year, I think, will be a breakout year for him. How is their strength of schedule? Says shots below the belt. I haven't necessarily checked it out. But when you're in the NFC South, your strength of schedule is very wonky. Let's just say that. Because you always feel like in your division, in your intra-divisional games, you always have a shot. But this year definitely feels different for the Panthers at the very least. And I think that while we're right in thinking that it can't get worse, I also worry about, like Anthony Manzano said, their scheme. If you're going to rely upon small, shifty receivers to win you football games, I think that's an interesting concept, but you definitely need a guy who is more of that reliable guy. And when I look around the division, as Shots Below the Belt says, the NFC South is trash. I think that there are more players on different teams, even though the NFC South is trash, let's be honest. I think that at the end of the day, the Carolina Panthers are just a team that doesn't necessarily know which direction it's going in. And I think that while they are trying to, like as Anthony Manzano highlighted, find that direction, they are kind of in this weird territory where, the NFC South is a division that wants to improve. But at the end of the day, it's certainly one of the worst in terms of talent. But when I look at the Falcons, when I look at even the Saints, when I look at the Tampa Bay Bucks, they all have players who fit that profile of guys who can really relieve the stress on their QB. We're going to have to see if Deontay Johnson, Xavier Legette can do that. As Tap to Learn says, Panthers have the 10th easiest strength of schedule. Thank you for that update. I did not know their strength of schedule, so thank you very much. But at the end of the day, let's talk about the NFC South as a whole. If you are going to bet on this division, I think that betting in terms of chaos and what could happen in this division is very risky, but it's also very entertaining. Because I'm not as high on the Falcons as people are, I'll admit. I think that the Falcons are also a work in progress. They have the most talent in the division on paper, but will it all fit together? What about Tampa Bay? They still have one of the most consistent wide receivers in NFL history, but they have a quarterback who works according to the system. And then the Saints, the less I say about Derek Carr, the better. But they're also a team that has, volatility written all over them. And then the Panthers, they're always going to be looking to improve. And with that schedule, like Tap to Learn said, I think that maybe you can see them pick up some wins. But it's all about, finding that consistency. But risk all your money on the NFC South at your own peril. That is my final thought for this segment. And this will conclude this segment as we transition to our last NFC division before we get to our QB positional profile to close out the show. The NFC West, my favorite division because of that team. Go Hawks. I will not be biased, I promise, during that segment, but we will be right back to talk about that segment after the break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of today's show. We are going to round out our NFC Divisional betting previews with my favorite division in the NFC, although I will not be biased towards that team in the background that you see there, the NFC West. And a lot of people consider this division to be the best in the NFC, and the reason why is that you had throughout the years, through many different teams' eras in the NFC West, all this competition, whether it be the legendary early 2010s 49ers Seahawks rivalries where they always meet it out, those legendary games where it's Colin Kaepernick, Russell Wilson of those bygone eras, to recently when the Rams have started getting more successful under Sean McVay. And then the 49ers, obviously we all know about their story, getting to all those conference championships, still haven't won one just yet in this 21st century. But without further ado, we do have to talk about this division. Because while a lot of people might still think it's the best division, I certainly think that outside of the 49ers, while, almost all of these teams could profile to be a playoff team, when I look at other teams in the NFC and the AFC especially, which we'll get to tomorrow, there are teams that really are taking that step forward. When I look at the Rams, they're a team that I really like. I really like Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, and Puka Nacua, that trio on offense. But it does rely on A, Matthew Stafford being healthy, and B, him not being a guy who just flames out as his career gets into its latter stages. And then I look at the Seahawks, and I will not be biased here. I love them. I love the Mike McDonald hire. I love what he's going to do for our defense. I love the Ryan Grubb hire on offense, hearing all the stuff that Geno Smith has been saying about the verbiage, the new depth of this offense. But they're also a team that could potentially be a year away from saying, well, hey, Geno Smith might not even start again. And then the Arizona Cardinals, a lot of people think the Arizona Cardinals are going to be sneaky good. I among them as well. I think that Kyler Murray is, in terms of, real life and fantasy, because this is a fantasy sports podcast and I don't want to forget that even though we're talking about betting, I think that Kyler Murray is a fascinating quarterback. He's always going to be dynamic. He has fantastic dual threat ability. He has a fantastic arm. And I think that, it's going to be all up to how he really gets this kind of weak receiver room to kind of solidify around him. And so this division certainly doesn't profile as one of the quote-unquote best right now. But it still is one of the most entertaining. So without further ado, let's jump into some of the bets that might make you a lot of money. Obviously, the 49ers are the favorites. As long as they have Kyle Shanahan, they have all the weapons. We'll see what happens in the whole Brandon Ayuk saga, because he could leave. But even without him, they still have the best weapons in the NFL, one of, if not the best defenses in the NFL. and so on and so forth. And at minus 200, it certainly seems like this is the 49ers division to lose unless, someone comes out of the ashes and says otherwise. They are the second to only the Chiefs in terms of Super Bowl odds, 6-1. And when I think about the 49ers, I think that this team believes that any year is its year. But as long as they keep on losing late in playoffs, I think that, it's going to be a very tough one. As Tap to Learn here says, how many playoff teams you think come out of the West? Listen, this is a very volatile division. I think that as many as 3 can come out of here, or maybe just even 1. I think that this division has so much depth within it, but all of these teams outside of the 49ers, who I'm most confident will, have questions. I like the Rams. I like Seattle. Maybe this is a year where, they are ahead of schedule in the Mike McDonald era. I like Arizona a lot. But there are certain caveats and pratfalls that all of these teams can kind of get into. But at the end of the day, the NFC West is going to be a team, or division, rather, mixing up my teams and divisions. I think that, any team from the West can be, in a couple of years along the road, contending for the Super Bowl. But we're going to have to see how this year pans out, because this year is important to how the power balance will be in the NFC West. And then Shots Below the Belt says, but has Purdy proved himself to be elite with top-name stars? Debo, McCaffrey, or Trent Williams get injured, he sinks. And also Tap to Learn says, in my humble opinion, it's the Niners and maybe one other, probably the Rams. I agree with that sentiment. But let's address that question that Shots Below the Belt says. Well, to start off, Brock Purdy is my fantasy quarterback, so I hope he's good without any of his weapons or as many weapons as he has. But that is a good point. But at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily as worried about Purdy, because in that system, you don't necessarily need, to be too prolific, and also he can rely on his defense a lot. I look at, to your point, the Browns game as an example, as some kind of game where the whole situation with Brock Purdy kind of went wrong. But at the end of the day, the 49ers are still going to be a solid team no matter what. And I agree that in certain moments when he loses top weapons, he looks a bit shaky. I'm not that concerned because of the profile of the whole team. And then getting into how Tap to Learn said, 2 teams make it out, the Niners and the Rams. I completely agree with that sentiment, although I'm going to be biased here. Don't sleep on my Seattle Seahawks. Maybe it will take them 1 or 2 years, but we'll be back, I promise. Let's get into some of the bets that I want you guys to be privy to. The best bet, Christian McCaffrey. Let's talk about him. At 1,500 receiving yard, at 1,500 all-purpose yards, rather, at 4-1. Those are very intriguing odds. And a lot of people, even though there's a lot of hype surrounding him, he's a number 1 fantasy pick. He's one of the best all-around players in the NFL. There are questions about his injury history. There are questions about him in terms of how he's used in this San Francisco 49ers offense. But, like I said, having an all-purpose guy like Christian McCaffrey means that he's going to be the guy to get most of the yards. He's going to get a lot of attention in this offense. And I think that as long as he's there, they're going to use him. And so, even though all of the injury prospects around the 49ers are scary, and it's happened before, I think that, McCaffrey will stay consistent. What's up to Diggs BTW 21? Thank you for the shout out, bud. Getting back to my point about McCaffrey, I think that he's just a solid citizen in terms of betting, in terms of fantasy. And I will not get off that sentiment in terms of betting in this division. And then, in terms of don't push it, let's talk about Puka Nacua for a quick second. Because Puka Nacua is really a player that kind of rose like a phoenix out of the ashes, came out of nowhere, really, to be someone who could not only be a supplementary receiver for the Rams, but also a true wide receiver one for the Rams. But this year certainly feels like a weird year for the Rams because nobody truly expected Puka to be that guy last year, but he was. And so this year, he might take a bit of a back seat. And I like how, this offense profiles, even if Puka Nacua is there, but at 1,500 receiving yards and a plus 275, I wouldn't push it. I think that there will be a lot of questions around Cooper Kupp, whether he can fully integrate himself back into this offense, whether he can still be a contributor, whether as the wide receiver 1 or 2. But at the end of the day, I think that Puka is not going to have as big a season. At 1,500 yards, certainly not. I think he can get 1,000, maybe even 1,200 or so, but not 1,500 this year. And let's talk about my favorite long shot bet in this division. How about my boy Geno Smith? 30-plus TD passes at 7-1. It's a long shot. Those are lofty standards for my man Geno Smith, but let's talk about this. I know this team and all its goings-ons in the offseason better than anyone. And I love the Mike McDonald hire, even though it's more defensive-minded. You get short of the defense, but the hire that matters in terms of this bet is Ryan Grubb. Staying in state, transitioning from college ball with the University of Washington, where we had one of the top offenses, might I add, last year in college football, to Seattle. I think it's the perfect fit. Geno Smith already talks so highly of him. Looks fantastic in that limited preseason action against the Browns. I'm really high on Geno this year. It is a long shot. And I said I wouldn't be biased. But can you put it past Geno? If JSN improves, becomes a competent wide receiver, maybe even beats out Tyler Lockett for that wide receiver 2 position. If DK Metcalf finally has a fantastic year, I think that this offense is cooking, man. I think that Geno Smith is someone who I really like. But then, another bet that really intrigues me. Let's talk about the Arizona Cardinals. We can't forget about them. They will have a say in this offense. They will have a say in this division, rather. And Marvin Harrison Jr. certainly profiled as someone to keep an eye on, because in the landscape of the Cardinals wide receiver room, if you look at everyone outside of Marvin Harrison Jr., Michael Wilson might be. I like Trey McBride at tight end, but he's a tight end. You need that true number 1 guy to complement Tyler Murray. As Tap to Learn says, where's the Hawks receiver room rate? Top 5? I say top 8. I think that when I think about the landscape of the NFL, I want to rate them in the top 5 and be a biased Seattle Seahawks fan, but I like a lot of wide receiver rooms. I think it's the most balanced, has the most depth, but when you talk about wide receiver rooms where, it's just 2 guys, let's talk about the Dolphins, I think that the Falcons could be an interesting one. The Eagles, definitely. Detroit could get more even. So it's definitely an interesting landscape. But I think the Hawks have the most depth out of any wide receiver room in the top 5, top 10 discussion. But let's get back to the Arizona Cardinals and the other side of the receiving spectrum in MHJ. 1,250 plus receiving yards. I think it's an intriguing bet. I think it's a lofty standard, but Kyler Murray has proven that when he has number 1 receivers like he had with DeAndre Hopkins in the past, that he can be a competent guy. And overall, I think that the Arizona Cardinals are a team that can profile to be sneaky good if everyone in this wide receiver core stands up to Kyler Murray's standard. But that will just about do it for this segment, guys. I like all the talk and the chat about this division. It's one of my favorites. But we now transition from divisional betting previews to the outlook of the QB position in fantasy. We have a lot of fantasy football drafts coming up. I had mine previously. We definitely want to talk about this because it's an interesting position right after this break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoy our show. Our first live show. Been loving the comments section. Keep it up you guys for this last segment. Should be a good one. Our first kind of fantasy oriented segment of the day. Certainly a good one to close out the show. We are going to be taking a deep dive into the QB position. Now, the QB position is one of those positions in fantasy football where everyone knows, well, you can wait. You can wait for as long as possible, and either you can get a tier 1 guy like a Mahomes or Allen if you're quick to it in 6th or 7th round, you have a high round pick there, but there are also reliable stars after that. There are also so many caveats and pratfalls that you might want to avoid in terms of how the season plays out, because let's say your quarterback gets injured. It happens to everyone. As my mother says, I want to hear your thoughts on Rodgers. We'll get to him in a little bit because I think he's going to be an interesting quarterback in terms of how he profiles in fantasy. But the overall landscape of the QB position is just something very interesting, because when I think about how you draft the QB position compared to how volatile it gets as the fantasy football season goes on, I think it's important to remember that you can always find good depth at the QB position, whether you feel like you've drafted horribly at it, and then going into the waiver wire. So without further ado, I just want to offer my opinions on that. So without further ado, let's talk about some guys in terms of situations in fantasy football who I really like. Let's start off with a safe risk in terms of a guy who you can flip. And what I mean by flip is if he's not playing well, you can kind of bench him and someone will stream him and you can pick him up as a streaming option. He's a safe risk at the end of the day, I'll say about him. It's CJ Stroud. And CJ Stroud is someone who I feel is going to be a guy who a lot of people like, but a lot of people might not be willing to have for a whole season. Because I really think that this year is the year of CJ Stroud, the year of second-year QBs. But in terms of second-year QBs, I think that the best option for a safe risk is him, because he profiles as someone who is going to have good games, but there's also someone who you might say, hey, I'm going to test the waters in terms of the waiver wire. I could, rely upon him maybe as a streaming option as well. And let's go to my mother's take. Shout out to my mom. I want to hear your thoughts on Rodgers before we get into any other of those. Aaron Rodgers, over many years as a Green Bay Packer, has built his success as a real-life and fantasy QB on his consistency in terms of point production. What I mean by that is he's someone who isn't going to be seen as a guy who can get you 3 to 4 touchdowns every given week. He's a guy who made his money with 20 to 25 point performances in fantasy. And for the Jets, I think that the way he fits into this offense and the way he recovers from this injury, most importantly, is going to go a long way towards determining how I view him in fantasy. Because he has the weapons, perhaps his best weapons his entire career, in terms of talent that he doesn't have to elevate, with Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall in that offense. But why I think I'm lower on Rodgers than I want to be is because of the fact, A, he's old, and B, his style of play doesn't necessarily translate to the modern fantasy game. It doesn't appeal to people in terms of a guy who you either want to stream or a guy who you want to start right away. And so I'm having trouble here with this graphic, but I will continue in terms of how to, talk about the QB position and guys who I really like. Let's talk about a safe bet here. I'm going to talk about Kyler Murray yet again. I think that Kyler Murray is someone as Tap to Learn says, who tops the QBs in rushing yards, Lamar, Murray, Watson, or someone else? That's a good transition because I think Kyler Murray definitely will be in that conversation, even though, we might say Lamar. So the safe bet is Kyler Murray in terms of just his ability here, his dual threat ability, his legs, his ability to, at the end of the day, really cement himself as someone who, even coming back from an injury, is a guy you rely on in this offense. And a lot of people will say, well, how will he be able to elevate his receiving core to get the point production and passing as well? I don't think that's necessarily going to be a worry if, he can develop a rapport with Marvin Harrison Jr., and I really like him. And my boy Shots Below the Belt here is defending Aaron Rodgers, saying he's a technical pocket passing quarterback. He hardly runs for the first down. That's a very good point, my man, but I think that those kind of quarterbacks aren't necessarily going to be helpful in terms of fantasy. He could help in terms of certain leagues or a PPR league where you might draft Garrett Wilson and he gets a lot of receptions and targets. It might help him, but at the end of the day, I want a quarterback who has that dual threat ability here, who has that ability to kind of be able to get yards through the ground and through the air. I'm not saying that Rodgers is not technically gifted. He is perhaps one of the most technically gifted quarterbacks of this generation, but in terms of fantasy profile, he doesn't necessarily fit. And even though he has perhaps his best weapons offensively, I think that he's hardly someone who is going to be a consistent guy who you want to keep around on your fantasy team. And then in terms of swinging for the fences, if you want an impact rookie, Caleb is the guy. We can talk about Jaden Daniels. We can talk about maybe Drake May, even though he has an atrocious offense. The less we say about that, the better. I think that Caleb Williams is just someone who profiles as a guy ready for this league. He's ready for the modern NFL. He's a quarterback who will fit the profile perfectly of a fantasy quarterback in terms of how to play within the system. And so I think that if you are someone who, say, wants to wait for a quarterback, and it's probably like the 8th to 10th round, Caleb Williams, if you have a high draft pick and say you've already gotten Mahomes, Allen, or Hurts, is someone who you might want to look at as a high-end QB2, especially in certain leagues, especially in Superflex leagues. I really like how he profiles there. At the end of the day, I just want to say this about the QB position, because the QB position, a lot of people think it's very tier-based. And in terms of who I believe rises to the occasion and who I believe will fail, really kind of separates in terms of two things: age and dual threat ability. The reason why I'm not high on Rodgers, like I said, is because he doesn't have that dual threat ability, and also because of his age. If you look at the people who are considered tier 1 QBs, you have Mahomes, you have Allen, you have Hurts, players who all these teams are investing in for long periods of time. If you look at the second tier, you look at guys like maybe a Stroud, you look at guys like maybe a Goff, guys of that nature. Those are also guys who you would probably take over your older guys like your Staffords and Rodgers. So it's going to be a position where you don't necessarily want to hedge your bets in terms of, well, Rodgers and Stafford are traditional guys. You want to go for a guy who fits your profile. And these guys who I've named and we've talked about in the chat are also there. And to finish today's show, this is a fantastic question. Is Anthony Richardson tier 2, says Tap to Learn. I believe that he could be, but I don't think he's there yet. And here's why. To close out the show, fantastic question to close it out. Anthony Richardson, if we go over what happened last year, if we take the small sample size that he had in the games that he started, he would have been the QB1 in terms of fantasy. And that's a standard that's pretty impressive for who he was. But if I look at the Colts, and we'll talk about them a little bit tomorrow, they certainly feel like a team where you have to have a lot of things go right. They're a very traditional team, in my opinion. You have Michael Pittman Jr., your wide receiver one, not necessarily a traditional wide receiver one. He's not necessarily someone who profiles as a superstar. Then you have Josh Downs, and you have either Alec Pierce or A.D. Mitchell, your deep threat. So it's a very traditional setup. Anthony Richardson feels like someone who is willing to work out of structure, but is also someone who is going to have to kind of play it safe within the system. Because the Indianapolis Colts feels very much like a system team. I'm not saying that he can't work outside of that. It's going to help him progress. But Anthony Richardson certainly is someone who I wouldn't necessarily put in tier 2 yet. I would put him kind of in a tier with, not necessarily that older generation, but those guys like Herbert maybe. Not necessarily Jones, but kind of guys in that 9 to 10 round discussion where you're picking your QB2. Because I can't necessarily invest that much time. That's an excellent question. And that question will conclude today's show. Hope you guys enjoyed our first live show. Love the comments from you guys. It's going to help a lot in the show. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. But that will just about do it. Thank you to my man Eric. Shots below the belt. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Chris Shepard. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow for another great show.